Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's so lovely to see so many faces I know. My current students will forgive me if I say the best faces to see are former students who have come back to the university because they've realized that learning is a lifetime activity. Our speaker today is Professor Sam Zeitlin. Sam is a lecturer in modern intellectual history at University College London. He first attended as an undergraduate Deep Springs College and then went off to complete his bachelor's work at Oxford, preceded by a master's at Cambridge and, for good measure, another master's at University of California at Berkeley, and finally a PhD from University of California, Berkeley, writing on the subject of war and peace in the writings of Francis Bacon, early 17th century, late 16th century British political philosopher. A fair number of Sam's writings have been on Bacon, and one of these days an important book on Bacon will issue forth from, can we still say pen? His fingers in some way. Sam is also a distinguished translator of German, the writings of Carl Schmitt in particular, and French. Two of his books. This is one of his translations of a writing by Carl Schmitt, early 20th century German thinker, called Land and Sea. I spent a lot of time this afternoon going through it, seeing if I could discover something about gulfs. America, Mexico, Gulf Coast. I didn't see anything, but perhaps it's there to be found. He also translated a short work by the 20th century French thinker Raymond Aron on liberty and equality. Sam, I think, is an unusual young man, and you'll excuse me for calling young. He was born in 1985. Very, for my students, trust me, that's young. You're just a lot younger, which is fine. The compass of Sam's intellectual trajectory is remarkably broad. He not only knows modern intellectual history, but ancient intellectual history. He is a literary scholar of sorts. He knows multiple languages. There's no interesting subject one can bring up to him in which he won't have an interest. And he has this most wondrous intellectual virtue of admitting things that he doesn't know. He doesn't pretend to have a grasp of things he hasn't studied, but when he does study, he comes to have some important awareness of things. We had Sam here on October 8th, 2022, talking about Stefan Ruzavitsky's movie, The Counterfeiters. And due to our good fortune, he happens to be back in the States. It's wonderful to be able to have him with us today. And today he'll be talking about directions in Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. Will you please join me in welcoming Sam to the Montesquieu Forum?
Thank you, Professor Warner, for the very generous introduction. Professor Warner is a very attentive reader, and I think the interest in gulfs will unfortunately be completely disappointed in the entirety of Land and Sea. So, also thank you for the wonderful opportunity to speak with all of you this evening. Roosevelt University boasts the only philosophy department in the English-speaking world in which my respect is high and unequivocal for the entire faculty, both of them. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu teaches that quality likely trumps quantity up to a factor of 10. But Sun Tzu was only giving a heuristic, and the Roosevelt Philosophy Department is a felicitous exception to Sun Tzu's rule. To chart the map of the talk this evening, I will offer a narrative reading of the opening of Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest, and then I will open the question of how we might read or study movies, and Hitchcock movies more specifically. What is it to read or to study a movie? How should we study Hitchcock movies in particular? Then I will discuss what I take to be the structure of the movie, a series of ascents coupled with ring composition, before offering some closing reflections. The title of this talk is Directions in Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. North by Northwest opens with a green screen. From behind the green, the growling lion logo of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, usually embossed in red and gold, fades in black and white, only to fade out. As the growls of the MGM lion recede, the music of Bernard Herrmann's overture strikes up. Herrmann's overture is a fandango. A fandango is a partner dance in triple time, and Herrmann's score bears a 3/8 time signature, overwritten with allegro vivace e con bravura, fast and lively and with daring. The green screen abides, only soon to be cross-patched with blue lines, descending leftward across the screen at 30 degrees below the horizontal, as if they were heading toward 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock on an analog clock face. Further blue lines descend perpendicularly on the right-hand side of the screen and ascend perpendicularly on the left-hand side of the screen, forming a grid, or the face of an office building, or a skyscraper. The final movement of the blue lines upon the green background is one of upward and leftward movement, northerly motion and westward motion. As the grid is formed, the credits begin to rise and fall against the grid in white typescript. After the words Cary Grant, Eva Marie Saint, and James Mason in Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest ascend and descend from the screen, the green and blue of the grid fade into windows and crossbeams of a Manhattan skyscraper, perhaps the United Nations building, in which the traffic and street life of the city are reflected. The title sequence of the movie, designed by Saul Bass, who also designed the title sequences for Psycho and for Vertigo, the title sequence is not entirely present in Ernest Lehman's screenplay for North by Northwest, and is a marker both of Hitchcock's direction and of the centrality of direction in the movie. Directions are seemingly omnipresent in North by Northwest. From the bellboy directing Roger Thornhill in the general direction in which Thornhill can send a telegram from the Plaza Hotel, to Eve Kendall directing Thornhill to Prairie Stop on Highway 41, near the center of the movie, these directions are hard to evade. Indeed, Thornhill will note that after all these involved and explicit directions with which Kendall sends Thornhill to Prairie Stop to be crop dusted, the matter is almost funny. Directions are present even in the minutiae of the background dialogue in the screenplay for the movie. I don't know if people have their handouts out, but if you look to the first citation on the handout, directions are present even in the minutiae of the background dialogue in the screenplay of the movie, although this part of the screenplay is actually reduced in the film version. For example, when Thornhill is waiting for Lester Townsend at the United Nations, voices on the PA system call out successively for, quote, and this is the first citation on your handout, Miss Knox of Ceylon, Mr. Mahdi, delegation of Pakistan, Please call the public lounge. Mr. Bernati of the Swiss Observer's Office. If one tracks a compass line from Ceylon, the British Dominion, which was to gain its independence as Sri Lanka in 1972, if one tracks a compass line from Ceylon to Pakistan to Switzerland, one would progress in a northwesterly direction. One would move through the country's northwest. Directions, of course, are even present in the title of the movie. Yet an early working title for the movie, which would end with a chase atop Mount Rushmore, was The Man on Lincoln's Nose, which, with a ban by the US Department of the Interior on shooting violent scenes atop Mount Rushmore, evolved into In a Northwesterly Direction, and then ultimately to North by Northwest. It is from the directions in the final title, North by Northwest, of the movie, that the film title seemingly acquires a Shakespearean reference to Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2. This is again on your handout, but I think this is conveniently with Act 2, Scene 2, Citation 2 on your handout. There, after talking with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, when Hamlet has been playing the fool or playing the madman, the Danish prince asserts that he is, quote, and this is quote 2 on your handout, but mad northwest, when the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw, end quote. As a compass, Hamlet is a bit off, but with a southerly wind, a wind from the south blowing north, Hamlet's compass can be righted. Similarly, Roger Thornhill's mode or way of life, Thornhill's life as an advertising executive, are such that the southerly wind and the arc of the movie as a whole can right them in a sequence of directional ascents. The opening credit sequence of the movie ends with, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, moving across the scenes of busy Manhattan street life, people fighting to board a taxi, packed pedestrians walking downward into the subway system. As the final credit, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, moves across the screen, the human Hitchcock, playing, quote, and this is from the screenplay, a would-be passenger on a bus, chases after the name Hitchcock, only to have a packed bus close its doors in his face. The cameo itself raises issues of identity. Are all the names given to the characters in the drama proper names or real names? And 2, the cameo raises the issue of whether the director of this movie, the human Hitchcock, fully gets on board with the departing vessel of transport. Indeed, a public ashtray stands perpendicular to the disappointed would-be passenger. The public ashtray is right behind him. Following the credit sequence, North by Northwest begins with a descent, followed by a series of ascents. A set of elevators in a Madison Avenue advertising firm drop down to ground level. As the doors open in Lehman's screenplay, quote, crowds pour out, and we hear a voice at the rear of the car, even before the man is revealed to us by the outgoing passengers, end quote. The man who exits the elevator is Roger O. Thornhill, dictating to his secretary, Maggie. Ernest Lehman's screenplay describes Thornhill in the screenplay as, quote, tall, lean, faultlessly dressed, and far too original to be wearing the gray flannel uniform of his kind, end quote. Thornhill's middle initial, O, stands for nothing. And Thornhill's initials taken together form R-O-T, R-O-T. Initials which the executive has embossed upon personalized matchbooks, which Thornhill carries with him, about with him. In short order, Roger O. Thornhill will be mistaken for an intelligence agency decoy named George Kaplan. If at the outset, and according to the screenplay, Roger Thornhill is nearly the man in the gray flannel suit, or as the screenplay would have it, the gray flannel uniform, then George Kaplan is nobody. Kaplan is visibly an empty suit. The man in the gray flannel suit is mistaken for the empty suit. Thornhill greets the elevator operator. Night, Eddie, he says. Say hello to the missus, end quote. The elevator operator, one of the numerous service workers present in the film, replies, quote, "We're not talking," end quote, alluding to the theme of marriage or matrimony, which recurs throughout the movie and which will recur at the movie's very end. As Thornhill dictates messages and advertising prose to Maggie, his secretary, Thornhill heads toward the renowned Plaza Hotel and its oak bar, and Maggie grows tired of walking to keep up with Thornhill's impatient stride, as it's described in the screenplay, and asks Thornhill to take a cab the remaining 2 blocks to the Plaza Hotel. Here, Thornhill shoulders a man entering a cab out of the way. Quote, "I have a sick woman here," Thornhill says, as he jumps the queue. As Thornhill and Maggie settle into the cab, Maggie notes of the man pushed aside, quote, "He knew you were lying," end quote. To which Thornhill retorts that, quote, "In the world of advertising, there is no such thing as a lie. There is only the expedient exaggeration," end quote. One of Thornhill's last dictations to Maggie before getting out of the cab is to, quote, "Call my mother, tell her about the theater tickets for tonight," end quote. As Thornhill exits the cab and the taxi speeds away, Thornhill realizes that his mother will be playing bridge at a friend's house, and Maggie won't be able to call her. The agitation persists as Thornhill enters the Oak Bar. At the bar, Thornhill meets Herman Weltner, Herman the Worldly, Herman Weltner, whom the screenplay describes as, quote, "an Ivy League costumed executive," end quote. Weltner in turn introduces Thornhill to Mr. Larry Wade and to Mr. Fanning Nelson. Introduced to Nelson, quote, "Nelson cups a hand to his ear," end quote, making a form of fanning gesture, so the name mirrors the gesture. Like the elevator worker, the secretary, the taxi driver, and the captain of the bar, all service workers, a bellboy is calling out in the bar for a Mr. George Kaplan, all while Thornhill's anxiety mounts about his mother not receiving his secretary's telephone message because she is at another friend's, another crony's, he says, another friend's house playing bridge. Thornhill waves down the bellboy to pass a telegram to his mother, and in so doing is misidentified as George Kaplan by 2 heavies, Valerian and Licht, standing outside the bar looking in, out of earshot. The bellboy gives Thornhill partial directions on sending a telegram from the hotel, only to direct Thornhill straight into the hands of the 2 heavies, who, mistaking Thornhill for Kaplan, point a gun at Thornhill's heart and accost him into a silver car that drives the advertising executive to the Glen Cove mansion of Lester Townsend, who works for Unipol at the United Nations. This is citation 3 on your handout. In an article for the New York Times, published on 4 June 1950, Hitchcock publicly pondered making a thriller about the United Nations. Quote, and this is citation 3 on your handout, "I should like, for example, to make a thriller about the United Nations, in which the delegate of one nation is denounced by another delegate for falling asleep in the middle of an important meeting, an important speech. They go to wake the sleeping delegate, only to find that he is dead with a dagger in his back. That would be the beginning of my story," end quote. The image from 1950, it would seem, stayed with the director and recurs in North by Northwest, closing out the first act of the picture. A delegate to the United Nations is found, quote, "with a dagger in his back," end quote. Across his productions, Hitchcock has a gesture that is repeated for murder, a gesture for murder, perhaps most clearly repeated in the television program Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which ran in the short version from 65 to 62, and then 62, 63 to then 65, so you would say 10 years on the whole, with which North by Northwest is directly contemporary. For Hitchcock, the gesture of murder is 2 counterposed right angles, formed by 3 lines, most often but not always the murder implement, a human forearm, and the line of the human elbow to the shoulder. The lines are formed by the murder implement joining a fist and forearm at a right angle, with the forearm braced sharply at the elbow to form a second right angle. So it's kind of geometric figure for murder in Hitchcock. The murder implement is raised above the head of the killer and above or behind the victim, and struck down upon the victim, mostly off-screen. This implement is a crochet mallet in Wet Saturday, an episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And that's the crochet mallet striking by murder is actually the same pose with which we first see Leonard, the character played by Martin Landau, in North by Northwest. So it's a crochet mallet in Wet Saturday. It's a shovel handle in Back Before Christmas. It's a monkey wrench in Revenge, and a frozen leg of lamb in Lamb to the Slaughter. All episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which Hitchcock himself directed in the years immediately preceding North by Northwest, so 55 to 58. And 58 is then the production year for North by Northwest, even though it comes out the following year, 59. In Breakdown, another episode of Hitchcock's show, the murder gesture is formed by a mechanical instrument. It's formed by a digger crashing into a fine automobile that paralyzes the character William Caillou, played by Joseph Cotton. So it's not only human gesture, it can also be formed, it can be formed by a machine in Hitchcock. It is precisely this gesture for murder which Roger Thornhill makes when he withdraws the knife from the corpse body of Lester Townsend at the United Nations General Assembly, and the image which graces the cover of the newspaper opened within the United States Intelligence Agency, in the building plaque for which one sees mirrored the image of the US Capitol before the montage fades into the cover of the Evening Standard, laid out on the boardroom desk, with Roger Thornhill's image holding the knife in Hitchcock's repeated murderer's pose. How does one read and study a movie? How should one read and study a Hitchcock movie? More generally, what is it to read a movie? What do we do when we read a movie as a work of art or a work of literature, or even as a work of philosophy? An objector here might pointedly claim that we don't read movies. We watch them. And yet, movies themselves frequently have a script, a screenplay, a set of storyboards, and if you look at the back of your image, we also have a kind of, not a storyboard, but an image of, this is Hitchcock's almost geometric image of how in the Oak Bar scene the camera should proceed. A screenplay, a set of storyboards, a large array of paratextual materials, from movie posters, like the one on the cover of your handout, movie posters to film trailers, as well as musical scores. In performing their roles, actors are reading, as well as following directions. In performing the film score, musicians are reading, as well as following directions. In addition, great movies with great directors, as Alfred Hitchcock assuredly was, may have something like an artistic vision, as well as technical sets of directions like these, technical sets of directions portrayed in drawings for camera movements, formal and informal instructions to actors, as well as writings and interviews describing, defending, and articulating their artistic vision. Through his French admirers at the journal Cahiers du Cinéma, Film Files, not least the future directors, Truffaut and Godard, among them, Hitchcock is often read alongside Howard Hawks and John Ford as an author of his complete filmography. This is sometimes called author theory in film studies. There are both advantages and disadvantages to author theory in film studies. On the one hand, in a world of mass production and giant studio production systems involving thousands of hands and millions of dollars, indeed the production cost of North by Northwest itself ran over budget to the then astronomical sum of nearly $4 million, it seems almost absurd within that context, the context of Hollywood production systems, it seems almost absurd to ascribe authorial intentionality to every aspect and every detail of any mid-20th century movie production, on the one hand. On the other hand, author theory in movies may have the advantage of directing the viewer's attention both to the rich detail and finesse of great works and to focus our attention on details we might otherwise overlook, as well as on the broad and significant statements of intent with which directors articulate their artistic visions and even their ideas. But author theory or no author theory, as readers and as viewers, we lose something when we forget or overlook that Alfred Hitchcock has an articulated view both about movies as an art form and about how this art form is related to ideas. We would fail to understand Hitchcock as the director understood himself, and thereby potentially miss important things about Hitchcock's art if we were to neglect Hitchcock's explicit statements of intention and intentionality in reading and in watching his movies. When we think about ideas, and when we talk about ideas, what are we thinking about and what are we talking about? As many of the great thinkers and philosophers from the 20th century, from Leo Strauss to Seth Bernardetti, remind us, ideas and ideation are bound up with images. Ideas are, in the first place, the shape or look of a thing. In relating movies to ideas, Hitchcock stressed that montage between shots and cuts combined together form ideas. And this is citation 4 on your handout, so a kind of explicit statement of Hitchcock on the relation between somehow cutting and ideas. One single cut, a cut, is nothing, Hitchcock writes. One cut of a film is like a piece of a mosaic. To me, pure film, pure cinema, is pieces of film assembled. Any individual piece is nothing, just like the O in Roger Thornhill's name, nothing. But a combination of them creates an idea, end quote. The cut of films for Hitchcock may be used to build emotions or to build ideas. So you can use cuts to either build emotions or to build ideas. For Hitchcock, interestingly, violence, expressed by rapid juxtapositions and by contrasting angles, violence for Hitchcock is an emotion rather than an idea. In an interview from 1963, Hitchcock lays out his view of how filmic montage may be used to build and to rebuild ideas. Quote, and this is citation 5 on your handout, and there Hitchcock has just distinguished use of cuts to make emotions from use of cuts to make ideas. Quote, now we have the other type of pieces of film, so in contrast to making emotions, among which violence, now we have the other type of pieces of film which create ideas. Rear Window, a very cinematic picture, his own picture, but a static figure in one position, in one room, for the whole picture. And yet, this is pure cinema. I'll tell you why. Mr. Stewart, James Stewart, star of the movie, is sitting looking out of the window. He observes. We register his observations on his face. We are using the visual image now. We are using the mobility of the face, the expression, as our content of the piece of film. Let's give an example of how this can vary, this technique with whatever he is looking at. Mr. Stewart looks out. Close up. Cut to what he sees. Let's assume it's a woman holding a baby, an infant in her arms. Cut back to him. He smiles. Mr. Stewart likes babies. He's a nice gentleman. Take out the middle piece of the film, the viewpoint. Leave the close-ups in, the look and the smile. Put a nude girl in the middle instead of the baby. Now he's a dirty old man. By the changing of one piece of film only, you change the whole idea, you change the montage. It's a different idea. One has a benevolent gentleman, his character changed even with that. End quote. In the time that remains, I would like to reflect on the structure of North by Northwest, both in terms of ascent and in terms of ring composition, in order to offer an example of how Hitchcock uses both plot, character, and montage to develop ideas as Hitchcock himself understands ideas. We might think of the structure of North by Northwest as a series of ascents. In keeping with the theme of directions, the first ascent is latitudinal. As the action of the movie progresses, the locales move westward from New York City to Chicago to Rapid City, South Dakota, a longitudinal progression across the United States. Yet the latitudes ascend with each progressive stop on Roger O. Thornhill's journey, from 40.7 degrees north in New York City to 41.8 degrees north in Chicago. So Chicago has a higher latitudinal elevation than New York. We might not always think that, but it's true. To 4.08 degrees north in Rapid City. The action of the argument is a latitudinal ascent. Hitchcock's latitudinal ascent is accompanied by a political ascent, an ascent first from the Plaza Hotel to the United Nations, and from the United Nations to Mount Rushmore, which one might describe as an ascent from commerce to politics, from the Plaza Hotel to the UN, and from politics to great politics, from the UN to Mount Rushmore. Throughout the movie, the intelligence agency is never called the CIA, although it is called this in Ernest Lehman's screenplay. And the intelligence agency, and in discussing the UN, so on the one hand, the CIA isn't called the CIA, but in discussing the UN, the Secretariat and the Security Council are never mentioned. The General Assembly, however, the General Assembly for Hitchcock is a site of bloody murder in the movie. Lester Townsend, when the real Townsend is finally encountered in the UN, Lester Townsend is a man who does not know what is going on in his own house, to say nothing of his own backyard. In Hitchcock's drama, the United Nations is a site in which the villains speak and the innocent are falsely accused. As the action moves westward, Mount Rushmore is a site at which the villains may be deceived and ultimately thwarted. The U.S. National Monument is a site for Hitchcock at which the villains perish and Hitchcock's heroes triumph. Next to the latitudinal ascent, North by Northwest is marked by this political ascent. Accompanying these political and latitudinal ascents is an ethical or vocational ascent for Roger Thornhill himself, from advertising to espionage. From a world in which there are no lies, the world of advertising, to a world in which there are lies. In the third minute of the movie, Roger Thornhill insists to his secretary Maggie that, quote, in the world of advertising, as we heard before, there is no such thing as a lie. There is only the expedient exaggeration, end quote. Immediately following this, as if to link the world of advertising to the world of appearances, Thornhill says, do I look a little heavyish to you? And then he goes on to say, think thin, think thin. As the claim that there is only appearance, appearance implies the absence of a substrate of reality, so the claim that there are no lies, or, quote, no such thing as lying, implies the absence of a substrate of truth. When in the dining car sequence, Thornhill asks Eve Kendall if she is the honest type, Eve replies, not really, end quote. If advertising is unwilling to acknowledge the distinction between truth and lie, the world of intelligence, which sometimes lies, is at least open to the distinction between truth and lie. And the world of intelligence has to be so in order to prioritize some information, some intelligence, as more salient and more accurate. The intelligence agents are, however murkily, aware that there is such a thing as a lie. Within the course of the movie, there is an ethical or vocational ascent from advertising to espionage. A final ascent in the movie is the ascent of love, which points both to the plot of marriage and matrimony, which we mentioned at the beginning, and with which the movie opens in the discussion with the elevator operator Ernie. So both toward marriage and matrimony, as well as to what we might call Hitchcock's Freudian side. At the outset of the movie, Roger Thornhill's relation to his mother is portrayed as almost too close. Thornhill's mother, Clara, played by Jessie Royce Landis, sniffs Thornhill's breath for alcohol, quote, and this is in the screenplay, like a bloodhound. The closeness, or excessive closeness in maturity, is also presented through casting decisions. The actress playing Clara Thornhill, so Roger O. Thornhill's mother, the actress playing Clara Thornhill, Jessie Royce Landis, born in 1896, was only 8 years older than Cary Grant, born in 1904, suggesting a more than natural proximity. It is Thornhill's excessive proximity to his mother which motivates the plot of Mistaken Identity in the Oak Bar. Only because Thornhill is worried about his mother not getting his secretary's message at her bridge game does Thornhill raise his hand to mistakenly be identified and mistakenly taken for George Kaplan. From the moment Thornhill meets Eve Kendall, Clara Thornhill, his mother, no longer appears on screen. It is part of the knowledge that Eve imparts to Roger that finally leaves Thornhill to leave his mother and cleave unto his wife, in the idiom of Genesis 2:24, and they shall be one flesh, end quote. Through the action of the movie, Thornhill ascends from being maternally smothered to a more or less healthy sexual and then matrimonial relation to Eve. For North by Northwest, Hitchcock contrasts to MGM, the lion growling at the opening of the movie, Hitchcock contracts to MGM for his sole movie with the studio. Contractually and importantly, Hitchcock receives final cut on the movie. It will surprise no one, certainly no one here, to observe that North by Northwest contains elements of classical ring composition in which plot elements, characters, tropes, images, and themes recur roughly equidistant from the center of the movie. The center of the movie, both in terms of time and in terms of ideas, the center of the movie is the crop duster sequence and chase in the cornfield in which there is no corn and there are no crops. This is Prairie Stop Highway 41. When Eve Kendall gives Roger Thornhill directions to Prairie Stop, Thornhill, in taking her directions, would be moving counter-directionally to the directional indication of the title. Kendall instructs Thornhill to, quote, take the Greyhound bus that leaves Chicago for Indianapolis at 2 and ask the driver to let you off at Prairie Stop, Highway 41, end quote. This is a directional movement south by southeast, or south-southeast, and it leads directly to peril in the movie's central scene, which also occupies the foreground and center of Hitchcock's movie poster for North by Northwest, which is replicated on the poster for the lecture this evening, which Professor Warner beautifully prepared. Thinking about ring composition in the movie, most superficially, let's go back to the MGM issue, most superficially, the title logo is present both at the outset and at the very end of the movie. Amidst the bright green backdrop screen, soon to be etched with blue geometric lines, as the bullet train enters the tunnel, and the screen fades to darkness at the movie's end. The title of the movie in its logo form, with the second pillar of the N pointing upward, and the crossbar of the T pointing right to left. Remember, Hitchcock contractually, with MGM, Hitchcock contractually has final cut in North by Northwest. He doesn't have to place the title, both at the very, very beginning of the movie and at the very, very end, final shot of the movie. As the film opens and the elevator operator, Eddie, whom we've met before, Eddie, who insists that he's not talking with his wife, introduces the theme of marriage at the very outset with the very first lines of the movie. So the movie ends with Eve Kendall being raised off the cliffs of Rushmore as Mrs. Thornhill. As the film closes with Eve and Roger embracing in the act of love, so it opened with Thornhill dictating ad person prose or ad man prose about, quote, for your sweet tooth and your other sweet parts, end quote. No less, Valerian's wife, so back to the theme of matrimony, Valerian's wife, Anna, who is the housekeeper in Van Damme's entourage, is seen both at the beginning and at the end of the movie, both at Glen Cove and at the modernist mountain retreat at roughly equal temporal distance from the beginning and end of the movie. 8 minutes and 28 seconds into the movie, Anna ascends the stairs in Glen Cove to let Van Damme know that Kaplan, really Thornhill, Kaplan has been apprehended by Licht and Valerian. 8 minutes and 28 seconds in. With 8 minutes and 28 seconds remaining in the movie, Anna returns at the bottom of a staircase, pointing a gun at Thornhill to detain him from rescuing Eve from the clutches of Van Damme at exactly equidistant points from the center. The professor, the head of the intelligence agency, similarly, is seen to close out the first and second acts of the movie as the action shifts first from New York to the train, and then again from Chicago to the final chase in Rapid City, South Dakota. North by Northwest thus has elements of both ascent and of ring composition. Think back to Hitchcock on ideas. What is the shape or look of these two movements laid atop one another, put together as in a montage, if you put together an ascent and ring composition? As if, in a montage, a series of ascents, if you compound them in your mind, what does it look like? A series of ascents in ring composition. How does one combine ascent with a circle? One combination is in the shape of an upward spiraling curriculum. The upward spiral is best juxtaposed to the downward spiral. In contrast to the ascending spiral, combining ascent with ring composition, the downward spiral is the iconic image of Hitchcock's immediately preceding movie, Vertigo, the image of which you have on the front of your handouts this evening. Hitchcock's immediately preceding movie is a downward spiral, a commercial failure for Paramount Studios at the time, and a film in which the hero's vengefulness allows the girl to fall at film's end. In North by Northwest, by contrast, Thornhill forgives Eve for sending him to a likely doom at the hands of the crop-dusting and machine-gunning plane. Thornhill lifts Eve from Mount Rushmore into the berth of a train bunk as the bullet train passes through an underpass. The themes of faked death, mistaken identity, matrimony, and complicitous murder are present in both Vertigo and North by Northwest. Yet the former ends in tragedy, and the new movie ends in seeming happiness in matrimony. The ideational structure and plot developments of North by Northwest are an imagistic reversal, a reversal in look from Vertigo. Having argued that the structure of the directions in North by Northwest form an upward ascending spiral via a series of ascents and ring composition, I would like to conclude with two further observations on the movie. First, we might watch North by Northwest as a kind of silent film in Technicolor. Hitchcock says somewhere that he prefers the silent version of the medium, the silent film, for Hitchcock. Silent films are marked by and for their purity. It is worth noting here a mutual relation between censorship and silence. One line in the movie was censored in audio, but not in image, and this comes in the dining car sequence between Eve and Roger. The censored line is spoken by Eve Kendall in the dining car scene. The censored line is, "I never make love on an empty stomach. I never make love on an empty stomach." That line is still visible on Eve Kendall's lips, even as the recorded sound is, quote, "I never discuss love on an empty stomach," but you can still see her saying it. If one watches the movie with the sound off, as a silent movie, the censorship is undone, and the original line, "I never make love on an empty stomach," is still present in the film. Watching North by Northwest as a silent movie undoes the censorship of the erotics of the movie. Second, in closing, let us recall the sole scene in the movie in the office of the US intelligence agency, called the CIA in the screenplay, but not called the CIA in the finished movie. Not all censorship can be undone. There, the intelligence agents are staring down at the headline, quote, "Diplomat slain at UN, assassin eludes police efforts," with the image of Roger Thornhill with knife raised in Hitchcock's murderer's pose above the racing results. If one looks closely at the newspaper, you get also other fake headlines. In the newspaper, one refers to Nixon. If one looks closely at the newspaper, the date on the evening edition is Tuesday, 25 November, 1958. The historical date on which Senegal received its independence from France, unmentioned amidst the fictive headlines. If one assumes that this is this first evening, 25 November 1958, which Thornhill spends on the train with Eve Kendall, so that's the night they first come together, and that the following day, 26 November, the action includes the action at Prairie Stop, the Ambassador East, the auction, and the flight to Rapid City occur on that day, then the day of the chase atop Mount Rushmore would fall on the historic Thursday, 27 November 1958. Thursday, 27 November 1958 was Thanksgiving Day, and Eve's rescue from the mountain would fall as a cause for Thanksgiving, almost an instance of gratitude, thanksgiving, and grace. If one may assume that Roger and Eve depart upon the bullet train back east that evening, 27 November 1958, if they depart that evening, as the seamless cut from the mountain to the train may suggest, after the bullet train has passed under the underpass, there is time for the newly married couple to awake on Black Friday. With this, Hitchcock's masterpiece fades into darkness at the end of the film. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
I'm really impressed with the way you organize and coordinate a number of different factors. And I'm struck by the downward spiral, upward spiral, vertigo. I'm wondering if you would make any comparisons to Notorious, where Cary Grant plays the CIA agent, and Ingrid Bergman is a reluctant recruit to allow the CIA to enter into the Nazi organization that's in Tsars. Because it seems to me that Cary Grant's role and Ingrid Bergman's roles are sort of reversed between the two films. Insofar as Eve Kendall is the actual agent and Thornhill is the reluctant agent.
Yeah, great question. So Lehman, in recounting the screenplay and how the screenplay came to be, but Lehman's not alone. Stewart was originally considered for the role of Roger Thornhill. So in other words, the parallels with the other Grant movies, that in a way, Cary Grant is amazingly Hitchcock's second choice for North by Northwest. So there's some sense in which the comparisons with Notorious and the other Grant movies are accidental in a way, but they're also there. And you can also think, I think you can think for the Bergman character as a kind of, I mean, it is both the reversal as you suggest, but you could also think of both characters as models for the future. Although it's partially accidental that Grant is there, but I think you can think of the Bergman character as the model for Eve Kendall. So I think it's a great question, and it's one of these things where, in a way, all of the Hitchcock movies prior to '59 have a resonance. If you think about the movie, whether it's Saboteur or Sabotage, where there's a person hanging off the Statue of Liberty, right, at the very end of the movie, that has its echo in hanging off, whether it's the nose of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. The kind of Mount Rushmore cliffhanger scenes have also these antecedents. Even on the train, Eve Kendall and Roger Thornhill refer to one another as strangers on the train. So there are these resonance moments, and Notorious is clearly one. The great question. I wish I had more on that. In fact,
I want you to comment, by the way, great work. I mean, you're absolutely right. Those famous vectors with the crop dusting scenes, like you said, Hitchcock, does everyone know Hitchcock was very intentional about everything that he did with a film? In fact, when he would show up to shoot, you probably know this, he didn't have any notes or scripts because he knew everything so well. He knew exactly what he wanted. What I want you to comment on is what you brought up, a whole other layer, which is really cool. This whole movie was on the surface level was his scourge of consumer culture. It was a rod. He's in advertising. And what the tell is the very opening of that film where the vectors come together. Though that's on purpose. And then they fade to a high rise. They're talking about this the birth of mass consumerism, advertising, and sort of the degradation there. So notice in the crop duster scene, all the crops are dead. And Hitchcock is doing, and so I just want you to comment on that because it's so multi-layered, and like you said, the newspapers. One of my favorite things in that is the newspaper, For Flea Lane in South Dakota. They're talking about Jefferson, Washington, do you know what I'm saying? I want you to comment as if the founding fathers kind of laid this out where everything was so free that this would happen down the road. So sorry to go on, but I'm enjoying this.
That's great. And so the advertising fits perfectly with like product placement in the movie, and it's also in some sense sinister product placement. So in the screenplay, in the scene where Cary Grant is kind of being steered drunk, heavily inebriated, off the cliff, it's a Mercedes, right? So it's a, you know, but also later on in Chicago, it's Marshall Fields. So there are these internal, and even the sites of the Plaza Hotel, it is itself also a commodity. To go there, both to stay there, but also to eat there, is itself a commodity. And so there are kind of sinister product placements. And that I think in a way, I would think we're on the same wavelength in a way that you have the ascent, you know, that would be kind of the low part of consumer culture, and in a way a kind of sinister or bad, you could say bad side of consumer culture. But all those things are there, and also all of the details, and it's inexhaustible. But it really is the 8 minutes 28 seconds, at least in the version that I have. It is that, and I think there would be more. In other words, so I think that there's, you know, in terms of the ring composition, there would be more things like that. But the detail is almost inexhaustible.
100%. That's why it's endured.
Great question. Other?
Do you think he goes back to his job as an advertising executive after?
I think it's ambiguous, but maybe he goes into espionage, right, or into love, right, which, you know, both of these says. But it seems like that he might not, right. Also, that his reputation, his image would be ruined, right, precisely from the Evening Standard. But as Eve Kendall says, you know, on every newspaper in America, he's the most wanted man. But it's seemingly bad for his imagistic reputation.
I wanted to ask, do you have like a particular methodology in how you take things on film? Like arriving to a script that is this well developed and noting like timestamps? Are you watching it over and over again, or are you skipping the particular scenes?
Yeah, I would watch it over and, but I'd watch it both. I mean, so you'd watch particular scenes over and over again, but also the whole. So Benedetti said that he would go fast and slow. So that he would try to then read things nonstop, like read Homer over an entire weekend, just nonstop, and try to see, okay, what's the arc of the thing? How does the arc mirror the Republic? Does the Republic mirror the Odyssey? This kind of question. If you read them fast, we're reading fast and slow. Just like, you know, there's a famous psychologist thinking fast and slow, but you could also reading fast and slow. Mostly, I mean, it's my own fault. Mostly, I'm reading slow, but I also think I don't read. You know, in other words, doing the thing that Benedetti did, where you read you know, over the day and you don't stop. Which actually, Benedetti must have been strong. I never met him, but he must have been strong to do it. I think that's actually harder in a way than reading, you know, close reading a little passage. But I think obviously you'd want to do both. You want to do both in terms of reading texts, but also reading movies, I think. I don't know if that speaks to the question or. Yeah. Good question. I had one in the back, and then go back. Yeah.
What do you think about the characterization of Eve Kendall as a character, as the main female love interest? Because I thought that her character was severely lacking in development, and she's this woman who, you know, basically her thing is she gets pushed around by men, like in her job, but you know, she keeps just doing things for other people, and I feel like the theme of matrimony falls flat a little bit because they get married, but he doesn't even really know her, and we don't even really know her, and I feel like her whole, you know, her personality is kind of lacking there.
Great. So just as Weltner, so in the names, right? So just as, you know, so Hermann Weltner, who's the person that Thornhill meets in the bar, right? He's like Herman the Worldly, you could say, Herman of the world, right? Who wears the Ivy League costume and who introduces him to fellow out-of-town sponsors. Kendall's name, you could also say, well, you could say, you know, so kennen in German would be acquaintance, but also know in a lesser sense, not necessarily to know it scientifically, but to know as in a form of acquaintance. But it's something like know-it-all, right? So it's like Eve know-it-all, but that has then a Genesis referent. But in the screenplay, I think you have a point. I think it's a good point that Van Damme, when you first meet Van Damme, the villain, Philip Van Damme, he's referred to as just man. So you have so in some sense, just as you actually encounter, and there is a kind of Genesis reference to this too, right? Before you actually encounter at first Adam and then Eve as named persons, you encounter the human before you encounter named humans, right? So similarly, Van Damme, who is also the partner of Eve in some sense, right? So there's a question of whether Thornhill or Van Damme is the Adam, right? Van Damme, not Thornhill. Van Damme is first man. He's just man, and then as you learn his name, he becomes Van Damme. Similarly with Eve, before she says her name is Eve Kendall in the famous dining car scene, the screenplay refers to her as girl until she actually says what her name is. So there's a parallel between Van Damme and Eve, but that's also a parallel that you get in the kind of biblical source text. And so in a way, it's, I mean, the challenge of Eve is also a challenge of the Bible in some sense. So there's a question there in terms of how, going back thousands of years to ancient literature, I suppose, and if that speaks to the thought, right? So in other words, I guess the problem wouldn't necessarily be specific to Hitchcock, right? It would be a longer, or the question would be not specific necessarily to Hitchcock, but a longer question, or in Western but also world literature about how are male and female human beings portrayed, but also how are human beings as such portrayed. I don't know if that speaks to the thought.
I was just thinking, is it, my question is her character, we don't get to know her because this is an old movie, or because, there was a reason for her to be written that way?
So I suppose the question would be, so I suppose that there'd be limits to knowing anyone. I mean, there's a question of how well would we know any human, right? So and I suppose that's also a question. There's a question for Hitchcock, but also for the Bible as well. How well does one ever know anybody, right? And I guess and so the other aspect of your question, the first on the kind of first go, is a question about maybe matrimony, right? So it's seemingly happy, but then in Hitchcock, a lot of the murders are spousal murders, one way or the other, right? Almost all of them, not maybe if not all, not Lester Townsend, but especially in the TV show, but also in the other movies, a lot of the murderers, and even say take Rear Window, for example, that's a spousal murder, right? Just take an example, but there are infinite. I mean, it's true in Revenge, it's true in One More Mile to Go. So the episodes from the show Alfred Hitchcock Presents, many of the murders are spousal murders. So there is an ambiguity about matrimony or married life, right? Married life doesn't always end happily, but there's something, Hitchcock thinks that there's something in the human that tends toward matrimony. But that's also, it mirrors in a way, it mirrors Genesis. I don't know if that speaks to thought, but I think there's a question about any person, how well do we know the person, right? There's maybe some aspect of any human. But Eve Kendall also has some good lines too. I mean, she has some smart lines. I don't know what do you think? Or
Well, no, I just think as a movie watcher, if the two main characters are going to get married at the end, I want to believe that their relationship is going to go well going forward. And he says that he's been divorced twice, and I have no reason to believe that this marriage is going to go any better.
I suppose it depends on whether they can get right. So third time. I suppose it depends on the other question of, I guess, the implicit thought in the movie. It would seem that there's an excessive closeness between Clara Thornhill, Roger Thornhill's mother, and Roger Thornhill, and that's portrayed in various ways. But there's maybe the implication that she maybe stood in the way of the success of the prior two marriages. And so I suppose the question is, do they return to New York, or maybe they return to Chicago and live happily ever after in Chicago? I have two in the back, and then we'll kind of circle back. If there's.
Is that you? Oh, you go ahead. The moment when they're falling in love, and Eve's face turns to the side and her eyes go to the left, I see that as a moment when they're supposed to be sharing profound emotion, and she's thinking instead. And I'm saying this basically to back up this question about Eve. Like, what is she? I think that's a big question in the film. And I don't think it's solved. Because why would you marry someone who set you up to be killed and then apparently didn't apologize?
And it is Kendall. It is Kendall, not Thornhill, that sets up the other person to be, after them having been together, right? So they are together, and then she does, send him to a likely doom, or a possible to probable doom. So that also complicates things. But I mean, the situation of the dining car, it depends on, Lehman had a contract with MGM, right? MGM lends Lehman. Also, Lehman is also, for the Sweet Smell of Success, he works with Clifford Odets, the great playwright. So there is, so it really also, Hitchcock only really gets to have Lehman as a screenwriter by the MGM move, right? So Hitchcock also he has a non-exclusive contract with Paramount for many movies, which actually then continues with Psycho in this kind of weird way that actually is shown in the movie about Psycho from about 13 years ago, that Paramount then distributes Psycho, but it doesn't actually, Hitchcock gets part of the receipts in terms of the production. But so it's a break in this contract with Paramount, but the Paramount contract is non-exclusive. But one of the benefits of going to MGM is that he gets to work with Lehman. I suppose also it's a question of a taste. I suppose movies also have, as Hitchcock says, Hitchcock thinks that you can use images to create emotions, right? And Hitchcock's not the only person in the tradition of Western thought that thinks that. Schmitt thinks that too, that you can use images to make and construct emotion. Maybe movies inspire strong emotions, but I think some of the lines in the dining car sequence are pretty smart. Kendall comes across as smart, right? She says she's an industrial designer, right? And she can at least pull off the appearance of being an industrial designer as well as being a spy, right? So that's not bad, right? And the best way to appear to be something is to be the thing, right? So to pull it off. And in the scene in the CIA, in the screenplay, the famous one is the professor, right? So the head of that CIA unit is called the professor, but each of the characters has a name. So they each hold down a job in addition to their CIA job. So one of them is called the cartoonist, one of them is called the reporter, one of them is a stockbroker. One of them is also housewife, just listed in the screenplay, in terms of what their names. But each of the people, and it would seem like Kendall would be industrial designer if she were at the board meeting. So that's a pretty, it's not bad for 1958, 59. Obviously it's not 2025, but for, this is, think about, I think it can think it in the British context better. But in 1958, 59, Princeton does not admit women, Yale does not admit women, Harvard has Radcliffe College, Brown has Pembroke, Columbia is all male. Columbia is all male, but Barnard is all female. In the UK context, the famous Oxbridge colleges, that's King's, Trinity, St. John's, Balliol, all those colleges, they are all male, right? So, if she's an industrial designer in that world, it's an achievement, it's her own intellectual achievement. And there's a way in which I think that the writing, and Lehman is a major screenwriter, and so that's actually one of the reasons for going to MGM that's not, as it were, authorial creativity, right? But it is actually a plus, is he gets to work with this really awesome screenwriter. I think that Lehman does give it to this character, that she's an industrial designer in 1958, 59. I don't know, also in the back, you've been waiting patiently, there are more. I don't want to, yeah.
This is more a question related to your personal preference, and I appreciate how detailed you are when describing the film. I was thinking about that, and I didn't really look at it from your perspective until, I was thinking more about it. And I was like, these are details I never really, paid attention to. So that kind of leads me to the question, are there other films that you can think of that you can kind of share a connection with when it comes to this film? Maybe in regards to, a resemblance, or maybe, any connections you can make?
Yeah, so going back to the early questions like Notorious or Vertigo itself, I think, if you were to study those movies, you'd see equivalent levels of detail. Robert Pippin and his stuff on Vertigo, but also on John Ford, on Howard Hawks, you would see an equivalent level of detail. But as the good question, maybe it was the second question, pointed out, for Hitchcock, it really is every detail. In contemporary cinema, maybe there's less attention to detail, but in the case of someone like P.T. Anderson or even Tarantino, even if not at the level, neither at the level perhaps of Hitchcock or Ford or Howard Hawks, there are many details that are very fine. I don't know if that speaks to the question, or
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I understand where you're coming from.
yeah, good question.
So I want to circle back to Eve Kendall and your structural observations about Hitchcock's praxis. So I think that if you think about the simulacra, right, the fact that both Roger Thornhill and Eve Kendall engage in simulations, right? So he paradoxically has to save himself by pretending to actually be the person that he's being hunted because he's presumed to be, right? And Eve Kendall has to engage in similar levels of deception for the purpose of saving herself, saving him, saving the United States,
stake, in this counter-espionage. And then I also think that there's a certain value in one of your quotes with which you began, which is this notion of the sort of reference, perhaps semi-conscious, unconscious, back to Hamlet, and the madness that Roger innate. He too pretends to be crazy, to accomplish his self-protection. But then this also made me think while you were speaking and while you were posing your question about a really famous lecture that Jacques Derrida gave about Hamlet that begins infamously, "I'm here to talk about that piece of bait, Ophelia." Now Derrida, of course, postdates Hitchcock, but it's still, that's available. Anyone can think of Ophelia in those ways because her father does put her out there as a piece of bait to try to find out what's going on with Hamlet. So I think that all of these deceptions and counter-deceptions and layers of deception throughout the film work in a way on a sort of structural level to push Roger Thornhill and Eve Kendall into relation. Their relation is simulated. And I think that that's also what goes to your unease with their relationship, that we know that both of them are engaged endlessly in these deceptions. And absolutely, how can you trust a person? And Anne Marie, you were asking that too. When the whole basis for your knowledge of each other is deception. And then this also goes back to the point that you were making about the film's overall project, I think, that you've captured so beautifully of interrogating all of this, as politics, as advertising. And so I wonder if you can say a little bit more. I love all of the work that you're doing with the ring structure. Are there other ways that you see that? Are there other character pairs that work in those kinds of ways in the film that you see as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a ton there. I don't know the Derrida text, but Derrida's a 1930 birth, right? And also coming of age in the world of film files. So there's something about his own formation, where he then he goes to École Normale Supérieure, and he that's the best. It's the 5th arrondissement. It's the best place for movies. Maybe in the world, but there are both historic cinemas, but also cinemas for every new thing. So in terms of cinematic education, he would have had as much if he wished, as much exposure to Hitchcock as anyone could have gotten at the time. So, but I don't know the Derrida text. There's a thought about you can have what are the possible bases for a relationship or for a friendship or for an erotic or loving relationship. One of those would be trust, as you mentioned, and that goes back to this kind of question about doubt, right? Another basis is potentially benefit, right? Benefit. You can have a beneficial relationship with someone that you don't necessarily fully trust. Also there will be degrees of trust. You could trust someone fully. You could trust them partially. You can trust them on some things, but not on other things. And you could recognize that their judgment is good on some things, not necessarily on other things. But also, one of the things we benefit and potentially also benefit epistemically or benefit in knowledge. And one of the ways in which Eve benefits Roger is through knowledge. She gives him the knowledge. She says, well, there's some things you actually don't have to hide, love feelings, right? And that's a gift, right? He had thought, it also relates to the question of his relationship with his mother, that he had to hide his feelings, especially his feelings of longing. She says, you don't necessarily have to hide. Some people might appreciate them, right? And that's a kind of gift, right? And if you want to think about the knowledge gifts of Eve to Roger, that would be one of the first ones, perhaps. So even someone who's tried to kill you might benefit you in some ways, and that would be one. Maybe in the back of the mid-part.
Yeah, I want to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
The question that I had in mind, you just kind of started talking about what I was going to ask. So I thought it was interesting that you said either Thornhill or Van Damme could be an Adam-like figure, because I hadn't perceived Van Damme as that, but I did notice, obviously Roger ends up with Eve, and then there's the scene right after they fake his death, could you talk about this juxtaposition between his graceful fall and the general upward spiral or ascent?
So, so the parallel, the structural parallel between Van Damme and Adam comes in, for example, in the Glen Cove scene when Thornhill is being, right before he's being filled with bourbon, so to then be put in the Mercedes, the product placement, the fatal product placement, you could say. And the parallel is that Van Damme's is not referred to as Van Damme in the script, he's referred to as man. Just as, to go back to the good questions about Eve, she's referred, until she says what her name is, it says, I'm Eve Kendall, her name in the script, or in the screenplay, is Girl. In my version, I have this kind of Faber and Faber version of the script, but it's layman's script. It's my page 23, and you even see it, so give Mr. Kaplan a drink, Leonard, that's effectively Van Damme, but it's M-A-N at the top, turns to his secretary, turns to Leonard and says, give Mr. Kaplan a drink, right? So it's not actually Van Damme saying, it's a man, right? And that would be also how Adam manifests himself as Adam, up into the first, so in Genesis 1 as the human, right? So male and female, he created them, right? But Adam becomes Adam, kind of closing out Genesis 2, you could say. I don't know if that speaks, closing out Genesis 2, and then in Genesis 3, you have the human Adam. So the human is named Adam. So you actually get the names after you get the humans. I don't know if that, so that was the structural parallel. Could you tell me, so maybe just repeat the part of the question about falling, because I was thinking about that structural aspect, which goes back to those earlier questions about, the good question about Eve. If you could say the fall part, because I didn't hear it.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the film as this upward spiral as opposed to a downward spiral in Vertigo, but they're emphasizing through various devices that he's having a fall from grace, presumably being exposed to some sort of transformative knowledge from Eve. So I wanted to see if you could talk more about the types of knowledge that she's showing him, and then also this structural relationship between the fall and ascent.
Yeah, so the two knowledge thoughts are one, distinction between truth and lie, right? So one of the first Thornhill lines is, in advertising, there's no such thing as a lie. Only the expedient exaggeration, right? Only the product placement. There's only product placement that benefits me, right, or benefits my client. But there's no such thing as a lie in advertising. So that's the opening thought. But by the time he's with Eve, he's talking about, are you the honest type or not? And when she says, are you the honest type? Well, she says the truth, actually. She says not really, but it's kind of, in philosophy, it's the paradox of the liar, right? This proposition is a lie. If you say, if it's true, it's a lie, and if it's false, then it's true, right? So it's that kind of paradox, that kind of philosopher's paradox is there in, are you the honest type? And she says not really. So there's the paradox of the liar, but that at least introducing the distinction between truth and lie, which was absent from Thornhill at the outset of the movie. That's one aspect. And that goes back to the good question about other things that he learns. And one of the things that he learns is not to hide the love feelings, not to hide the feelings of longing. He says to Eve, I'm embarrassed, or I worry that I would offend someone in expressing my longing for them. And she says, well, that may not always be needed. So those would be two elements, two propositional elements, or two things that Roger learns from Eve. At least in the reading I've presented here, those would be ascents in knowledge. So to go from a place where you don't have any distinction between lie and truth, to a place with, even in the circles of espionage, even when the spies lie, or even when the spies deceive, there is some aim at truth, or some distinction of degrees of falsehood. That would be an ascent in this, at least in this reading. And similarly, it would seem like the relationship between Thornhill ascends in life as well as in knowledge from getting some distance on his mother, who's only 8 years older than him, to moving toward Eve Marie Saint. But there could be other readings, right? I mean, that's one of the rich thoughts about what makes a classic a classic. There are also multiple readings of the classic. This is one reading. I've tried to make it a detailed reading. Stuart in the back, and
The man, we later learn his name, Van Damme, enters the library and he says, exactly how Alfred Hitchcock always presents. He's being filmed behind the desk of the Townsend Estate Library, where there is an empty chair. We then go forward to the scene at the intelligence agency, where the professor is with 4 other agency officials, and the camera is located right at the empty chair. So in both instances, the camera in effect occupies a chair as if it's the director and fixes on the professor and Van Damme, which suggests that the two have something in common, perhaps connected to theatricality, bringing a certain kind of making into effect that would have everything to do with Genesis. And related to that, at the very end of the film, after Leonard is shot, Van Damme caustically turns to the professor and says, "That's very bad form. You've had to use real bullets." Again, contrasting something that's real to the theatrical. So it looks as if they're fundamental proximate causes in setting into motion a certain kind of action. One could add something about, I'll just mention this in passing because it's right up your alley, even though it's completely crazy. In the second quarto of Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2 has 540 lines. At line 270, which is dead in the middle, Hamlet says, "Oh, what a thing man is." And then he asks, "What do you make of the quintessence that's drawn from dust?" And that's dead center in the middle of that scene, which I think corresponds to the crop duster scene as well. So it's a way of pointing to, trying to reinforce the structural elements, but using these two figures as both opposites but equals, Van Damme and the professor, in setting the action of the movie forward.
Yeah, so that also goes back to the question about structural parallels, right? And that Marianne Keene has that reading of the movie. So the parallel between Van Damme and the professor is central to that reading. So it's already in a reading. So but it, it is there, and they're both, as it were. The question is, how equivalent are they, right? And so that, and that would, it has the potential to upset this view of the ascents, right? So if there is no ascent from the UN to Mount Rushmore, or there's no ascent in knowledge, from hiding your feelings of longing to being able to express them openly, then the kind of ascent reading falls apart, and similarly this upward shaping spiral also falls apart. You'd still have ring composition, but you wouldn't have the ascents. Let's say, so if you flatten that out. And the question is, what then speaks on the other side of that? And so also similarly, both Van Damme and the professor are willing to let Roger Thornhill die under some circumstances. Now the question will be, what are there salient differences between the circumstances? So Van Damme is willing to really go out of the way to make it happen, whereas for the professor is willing to let it happen, right? Let it happen for the sake of saving Eve Kendall as an internal operative kind of double agent against Van Damme. And the question is whether there's any moral distinction there, right? And so if there is a moral distinction between those two things, then you could preserve the ascent, right? So then it becomes less of a parallel between the two characters. But the view of them both, as it were, giving directions. One of the constant themes in Van Damme's relation to Roger Thornhill, both as man but also as Van Damme, is that Roger Thornhill is a bad actor, right? As Kaplan, he's a bad actor. You seem to be playing the part badly. He says he should go to the actor's studio, at which Eve Marie Saint actually studied, right? So, but there's an internal reference, also product placement, right? So you pay to go to the actor's studio, but and that's invoked by Van Damme, and he says, either Roger Thornhill or George Kaplan or Cary Grant really should go to the actor's studio, and that would solve the problem. So there's that part of it. I don't know if that speaks, but so the thought of if you make the professor and Van Damme equals the ascents. I mean, in a way, that's a way of kind of flattening the ascent, let's say.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, so take both, or?
Quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, this is today was my second time seeing the movie in like the past year. One of the things I don't really understand is like what's Van Damme's motivation to like do all this stuff. Yeah, I understand if he's whether doing it for like monetary gain or whether he wants to, destroy the capitalist state like a true comrade. I don't know what he's doing it for.
Yeah, so the thought is that, I mean, so the thought, maybe it doesn't matter, but the thought, the green opening, right? Green can stand for a number of things, right? There's something like also an ascent from you could say envy or jealousy to death, right? But also green is the color of money, which is also the world of advertising. And if there are ascents, right? So the motivation of Thornhill and Van Damme, at least at the outset, would not be wholly distinct, right? If they're both monetarily oriented. But insofar as if there's a movement, either toward country or toward, defending a good order, even if it's beyond, this particular country, but a good order generally, then that would be potentially an ascent, right? Then that would not necessarily be just money, just greed. So I think money is suggested. Also, the auction, the value of the MacGuffin, this kind of dwarf-like thing filled with microfilm, right? So in other words, it's a film where the chase is going after film, right? And actually, when the movie goes into production, Lehman writes that when the film goes into production, Lehman hasn't actually finished the screenplay. So in other words, they don't actually get the screenplay until the movie is in production. So it's a chase, as it were, after a chase. So there is a kind of self-reflective element of the chase, right? So Hitchcock likes this figure called the double chase, in which there's a hero. The hero is being chased by the authorities, and the hero is chasing the true villains, right? And you get that even in Hitchcock's silent movies, like in The Lodger. The Lodger is actually pursuing the real villains, but the Lodger is suspected of being the murderer himself. So it's a structure that Hitchcock calls the double chase. And you have the same figure in the early silent movie. The Lodger, I think, is 27, 28 in terms of production or release, 27, 28, but it's a silent movie. And Hitchcock directs the first speaking English language movie in England, right? So he's someone who lives, like Ford and like Howard Hawks, he lives the medium. But one of the plot devices that Hitchcock wants is this image of the double chase, where you have a hero chasing the villain, but at the same time the hero is being pursued by the authorities. In other words, the police are chasing after Cary Grant, right? Cary Grant has to put on the hat to pretend that he is either a service worker himself helping Eve Kendall with her luggage. I don't know if that speaks. I mean, but I think your question is a question in the movie. It's not actually clear what Van Damme's motivations are, but then you could also ask. I mean, and this would be an assent form of the question: what were the Rosenberg's motivations? Right? There's this kind of thing. What are the motivations of anyone to betray their country? So that, yeah.
Can I make one observation?
Yeah.
After the plane crashes in the Montesquieu scene, Roger Thornhill steals a pickup truck. And I don't know if you know, but he parked the pickup truck about 100 yards away from here, right by the Indian statue on Michigan.
I don't know. I have no response. But that's great. That's great. I don't know if there.